Hello, welcome to episode 4. Let's get into Exodus. Now, Exodus is about, mainly, we got one main character, whereas the last previously we had Genesis, so it was about, I don't know, like 5 or 6 main characters. Exodus, mainly about one, couple side characters. Okay, let's get into it though. Now, where we left off, right, with Joseph. He was in Egypt, right? He was the second under Pharaoh. And he had his family brought over. And, which made more sense at the time for his family to come to him in Egypt than it would have been for him to go to them in Canaan. Now, it's important, in my opinion, to keep in mind. Because a lot of people get it confused and think that the Israelites and the Canaanites were the same. But they weren't. They weren't. It began with Abraham, right? Abraham, who was Sumerian, he was actually Sumerian, left Samaria, and migrated to Canaan. Now, his children and grandchildren may have adopted, like, the Canaanite languages and whatnot, and this, that, and the third, but they were not Canaanites. So, and it even says here clearly in the Bible, it's a little racist and rude, that they refused to even, like, intermingle with the other Canaanite women. I try not to get too hung up on the genealogy in the Bible, but it's a little tricky because it keeps going back to it. It keeps going back to it over and over again. So there are little things that I wanted to point out. This subject of like, genealogy and things like that. Why it's brought up and strongly suggested in the Bible. Well, my guess is because, and this is just my opinion. I'm allowed to have my opinion. But, like, I think the Bible, at least the Old Testament part, not necessarily the New Testament, much of it, but, like, the Old Testament at least, it's very much a blueprint for MK Ultra. That's just my opinion. I'm putting it out there and I'm saying it. I'm allowed to have my opinion. So with that said, they put a lot of emphasis on, the genetics and like eugenics and things like that. So, the Israelites. Technically, I know everyone says that the Israelites were from Abraham. And yes, they are descended from Abraham. From Abraham's grandson, Jacob. Jacob is technically like the forefather of all the Israelites afterwards. Okay? I don't know why specifically Jacob. They don't really say why specifically. But Jacob. He is like, that was his name, was Israel. So, he had 12 sons, which were the 12 tribes of Israel. And I'm just going to say their names, then we're going to get into Exodus, because it's important for Exodus. Jacob's sons were Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And between all of them, by the time they got to Egypt with Joseph, oh yeah, and Joseph was another one. When they got there to Joseph, they had like 70 or 75, kids and grandkids at that point. So, it was quite a tribe. Well, at that point, 12 tribes, of families, coming into Egypt. Now, our main character, Moses, it doesn't give an exact genealogy, but somewhere along the line, he is descended from Levi. But as long as, like, Joseph was alive, they were all upper class, no matter how many they were, because, he was second right under Pharaoh. And, so as long as Joseph, and I'm assuming the Pharaoh at the time was alive, everything was all good. But when, poor old Joseph kicks at us, then, they're kind of like, become nobodies overnight, essentially. And not, like, actually. I just mean in the point of view of the Egyptians. They kind of just become, like, whatchamacallit, just extra mouths to feed. Just, like, you know what I mean? So, this is what the Egyptians do. They pretty much kind of enslave them because they don't necessarily want them to leave either, because they're afraid if they leave, they're so numerous at that point that they're going to, come up against them. So they don't want them to leave. So they turn them into slaves, essentially. Well, in the Pharaoh's mind, it's like, at least, okay, this is what the scripture says, and I'm going to tell you what I think. Scripture says, they become like so numerous and whatnot, and that the Pharaoh thinks that if he just like puts them to work extra harsh, extra shrewdly, like makes them work longer hours and whatnot, that they'll just be so busy and miserable that they won't have more kids. I guess it's what it's trying to say. So when that doesn't work, he, out of sheer desperation, he goes to the midwives for the Hebrew women. He goes to the midwives and asks them for help. I don't know why Hebrew midwives would help him, but maybe because he thought he was Pharaoh, he got what he wanted. I don't know. But he wanted them to kill the babies, but only if they were boys. And obviously the midwives don't comply. But they come up with a brilliant excuse. It's because they say that the Hebrew women give birth before the midwives get there. So it kind of saves their lives. The Pharaoh is furious. So he pretty much makes it like a law that if any Hebrew boy is born, that they be thrown in the Nile River. It's kind of a horrific law. And the reason given is because of the population, right? But it kind of makes me wonder, though. And this is where I'm speculating here. Like, why the boys? Why specifically baby boys? And I'm a little confused by that notion. Maybe it's an ancient mindset. Maybe it's part of the patriarchal, inheritance. Maybe it's because back then the baby boys, just as sad as it was, were more valuable than the baby girls. I don't know what the reason was, but here's where I'm speculating a little bit here. You would think that if it was about population control specifically, that you would go after the girl, right? Like, how is having, is it so you can have the women for yourself? That can't be it, because it's supposed to be about... Well, I mean, because I don't know, because the way it worked, if they did take Hebrews for wives. But you see, they didn't, though. They didn't take them for wives. They were just slaves at best. So I don't really understand. That's where I kind of get into the notion of this, let's say if we dig into the ancient aliens, conspiracy theory, that Yahweh here is Enlil. And that, possibly Amun-Ra is Marduk. We get into that little, if we get into that, right, and look at the videos linked below if you don't know what I'm talking about. But if we get into that, then it would make sense. If you didn't want any, star seeds or whatnot, or specific star seeds at that, to come in through that certain, I don't know. It seemed very deliberate and specific. I don't know. I just feel like there's more to it just that. And maybe it has nothing to do with the ancient alien stuff. Maybe it's something totally different. But I don't know. It's just the boys. It seems very specific. I don't know. Look, I don't know. I'm just saying. It's odd, is it not? You would think if it was about population control, they'd go after the girls, right? Or all of the babies at that. If you just wanted to wipe out their whole entire population, you could have just... you obviously aren't above killing babies. I don't know. It was just a little strange. But let's move on from that. So, where does Moses come in all of this, right? Well, during all of this baby killing that's going on in Egypt of the Hebrew babies, Moses is born to someone who is descended from Levi. from the Levite tribe. And she gives birth, and he's a boy. Well, she, gets scared, so, she makes a basket. And it's funny, because if you look at the subnote here, Exodus chapter 2. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. Alright? When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. Pause. It was after she saw that he was a fine child. That's a little weird. What does that mean, fine child? It might just mean healthy. I don't know. Don't want to speculate too much. But she hid him for at least 3 months. But in verse 3, it says, but when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket. Now, there's a subnote here next to papyrus basket, meaning that the Hebrew translation could also mean ark, because it's the same word used back in Genesis 6 for ark. So it's very strange. Like an ark? What ark? Like, what are they talking about? But I find that very odd that they use the same word from, But anywho, I don't know if it's any connection or not, but it's strange. But whatever it was, a basket or an ark, they put it in the Nile, thinking it would be safe. And the Moses' mom had his sister Miriam, who was a little older, sit out there and hide in the reeds and just, make look over the basket, make sure like an animal wouldn't come and eat them, or nothing bad would happen to them. Well, one day, I guess an Egyptian princess came out. It just says the Pharaoh's daughter came out there to bathe, and then she finds the baby, and then she she gets her slaves to get the baby and bring it to her, and she thinks he's cute, kind of makes it sound like like a baby doll or something, like aw. And then Miriam watches all this play out, and then she kind of pops out. I don't know what she's pretending to do, what reason she gave for being there, it doesn't say. But she says that she knows a Hebrew woman who can nurse him for her. Isn't that convenient? So the Pharaoh's daughter says, oh, yes, go do that. Go get her. So, Miriam just goes and gets her own mom, who is Moses' mom. I have no clue if Pharaoh's daughter knows that's his actual mom. It doesn't really make that clear. But apparently not, because she pays her to nurse him for her. And she names him Moses. Now, it's weird because the footnote says Moses sounds like Hebrew for draw out, but also Moses is an Egyptian word too. I mean, it's an Egyptian word. And if I'm not mistaken, I heard one Egyptologist say that it's most of the time the word Moses in the Egyptian language is usually preceded or followed by the name of a god or goddess or something. Tutmosis would be Thothmosis, Almosis or Ra-Moses, it's usually has a god on there. And the Egyptologist says that to most, in the language context, it doesn't really make sense to not have one. But I'm not really sure the full meaning of the word Moses. There's more people way more knowledgeable on that subject than I am, so I'm not going to pretend like I know. But anyway, so, Moses grows up relatively good. I mean, I'm sure doesn't have the status of an actual royal, but he grows up in the royal place and whatnot. And when he grows up, he's out and about, and he sees an Egyptian beating on some of the slaves. And then he gets mad and he does something about it. Acts like a vigilante. Well, he hopes nobody saw him do it. And so, he buries the Egyptian's body and, just kind of doesn't say anything about it. Hopes it goes away. But then, another day he goes out. And he sees some of the Hebrew slaves, arguing amongst each other. And he, being nosy, wants to get involved. He's like, why are you guys sitting there arguing amongst your own friends and whatnot? And then they kind of, like, snap back at him. They're like, who are you to talk when you're, They somehow knew about his crime. I mean, I doubt you can, like, commit a crime in, like, the slave quarters without them knowing. I'm sure it's not exactly very spacious for them. So I'm sure it was witnessed by someone. And I'm sure word spread quick, and it did. And so Moses realizes, oh crap, I've been caught. And then, like I said, word spread quick. Pharaoh finds out that Moses unalived an Egyptian. And so then he, in turn, plotted to unalive Moses. So then Moses is like, I gotta get the heck out of here. So he flees. He flees Egypt and he goes to the land of Midian. Now these places, don't forget these places. And it can be hard because there's a lot of names to a lot of places. But Midian is very important, especially later. And especially considering he meets his wife there. He meets his wife. He actually rescues her and her sisters from some shepherds who wouldn't let them drink water from a well. And then he marries a woman named Zipporah. And they even have like a child and whatnot. Oh yeah, they have a child named Gershom. And Gershom, the footnote on Gershom says a foreigner there. So basically because Moses was a foreigner, she married him. And their child was a foreigner, so... I guess that was their custom. Who knows? I'm not going to pretend like I know what Midian had going on with all that. But, it was acceptable enough for them to have children and whatnot. So, but, while, Moses was there for apparently a very long time. Like, long enough to establish a family and whatnot in the land of Midian. And during all that time, that Pharaoh that, had wanted to hurt Moses was gone. He was long gone. And... at some point, it says, let's see, where's the verse? Okay, here we go. Exodus 2, 23 to 24, or 23 to 25. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked down on the Israelites and was concerned about them. As he should have been. But at this point, Moses himself was not all that concerned. Like I said, he had been in Midian for a long time. He'd established a family. He had a wife. He had children. He was living his best life. But meanwhile, his fellow Hebrew friends didn't, have it so great. And if it was, during the reign of Ramses II, like many scholars speculate, I'm sure it wasn't. Oh my gosh, there was so much construction done, during that time period. A lot. I mean, and not just him. It was a lot of pharaohs that did that. But, he especially, had a lot going on as far as, building stuff, especially using slavery. Now, I'm going to leave it there for now. Because I'm going to come back later and, continue Exodus. I'm going to try to get as much done as I can in one day. But I just wanted to leave off and let you know, set up the backseat, Moses and his family at the time, okay? They're shepherds, and his father-in-law, Jethro, is the priest. Meaning, so his wife Zipporah is the daughter of the priest of Midian. Which I think is important. And the particular mountain that Moses was on when his and Yahweh's exchange took place was Horeb. Keep all that in mind. I'm going to try to come back with a map to show you guys where all these places are. Because while I don't want to get hung up on the bloodlines and whatnot, I think the geography is very important to remember. So anyways, I'll be back later.